Hello, my name is Bob Brown, and it's my privilege to host this show, which is based on the reality that Westborough is a great town filled with interesting people. Many of them are long-term residents who have so many memories and stories about life in Westborough in days gone past. And so your local cable station, Westborough TV, has initiated this series of programs which are designed to reflect upon life in earlier days and to possibly make suggestions about how we can improve life in this fine town for the future.
Citizens of Westborough, I am honored today to be able to talk with one of the heroes of our community, Joe Nason. Joe stands out in my mind as being one of the finest gentlemen I've ever met, and his war story, and as well as his lifetime experience in Westborough, is something which needs to be told and remembered. And so I'm thrilled to have this chance to talk with Joe a little bit about his life in Westborough and about his Navy career and anything else he'd like to talk about that I think the town just needs to know a lot about. And so I consider it a real honor, Joe, to be able to be here with you and to talk with you about, just in a casual way, your life. Because this is a story about you and your life in Westborough.
Well, I think you've been one of my strongest boosters
Well, I'm happy to be a booster.
for years, Bob.
Yeah.
That piece that was in the Westborough News several years ago was so laudatory that I was perhaps a little reluctant to shove it forward. It made me look like a somewhat of a saint.
Well, for me you are, Joe. For me you are. I have tremendous admiration for you guys who protected this country back in the days of the Second World War and did so much for us. I'll be always deeply indebted to you. My dad was in the Navy, and he was not happy that he couldn't go into combat. He was set in an office down in Washington, D.C., and he was furious about that. But he helped me understand a little bit about what wartime was all about and what the sacrifices were that you guys were making.
Well, the spirit to get in that war was incredible. Everybody wanted in.
Yeah.
And there was hardly any of my friends that stayed out. Practically all of them were members of various armed services.
Yeah, yeah. It's great.
Yeah. And we used to circulate a letter from one to the other, you know, back in the 41s.
Yeah.
41s and 42s, and it would go from Dick and Belle Emery to Bobby Hennessy to Billy Thomas to Donnie Bullard to me, and et cetera, et cetera.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. That's great.
We'd all tell what we were doing and where we were.
Yeah.
And
why don't you go back a little bit, if I can just drag you back to your beginnings in Westborough. Tell me a little bit about your family, your mom and your dad. And
oh, well, it's rather a simple tale. My mother and father were both born in Westborough. My great-grandfather was a sea captain from Kennebunk, Maine, and for some reason he decided to leave the Maine coast and chose Westborough. Now, I have no idea how he reached that.
probably Lake Chauncey, do you think?
How he reached that decision. However, that was around the time of the Civil War that he came, and he bought a house on the street that runs down and goes to Hopkinton, whatever street that is.
South Street?
South Street, exactly. He bought a large sort of southern mansion house, and he didn't build it, it was there. And the family was brought up there for the most part. And interestingly, Bob Hennessy's grandfather later lived in that same house.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when the Fosters bought it, it was their intention to restore it. However, their architect persuaded them that the best thing to do was tear it down. Now, whether he wanted to do that for selfish reasons or otherwise, I don't know. But as you know, there's a beautiful house on the site.
Yes, there is. Howard Foster's house?
Howard Foster's. And there's a tennis court and a nice pond in
Right.
back of it,
Right.
full of fish.
Yeah.
And
We used to sneak in there to skate.
that's right, yeah. So anyway, that's when the Nasons came to Westborough. My mother's family, the Gateses, were from Petersham.
Hmm.
And my grandfather moved to Westborough and became a prominent figure politically. He was a town senator for the district and representative and town clerk. And I remember when he died, my mother became sort of town clerk pro tem. At any rate, people used to come to get married. He was also a justice of the peace.
Was he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one couple came with 7 or 8 children, and he said, how long has this been going on? And they said, well, you could count. And he said, well, it's about time.
Great.
He was somewhat straight-laced, I should say. He was they were strong Unitarians, the Gateses,
Yeah.
whereas the Nasons were Episcopalians. I don't know whether strong or otherwise.
Yeah.
And so my mother and father were both born and brought up in Westborough. And so when I came along, it was a natural breeding ground for me. And I loved Westborough as a town. My father sent me away to prep school, which I decided was the worst thing that could possibly occur in a youth's life, you know.
That's right.
And Westborough was very much loved by everyone that lived there, particularly the kids.
Yeah, you had some great buddies, didn't you?
Yeah, we had some good buddies, and unfortunately, my high school days were numbered, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And before long, I got sent away to Pauling School in New York
Oh,
State,
yes, yes.
where I languish. Always writing, come and get me, I want to come home.
What did your dad do?
He ran J.S. Nason General Store, I guess you'd call it. Not a general store in the sense of foodstuffs, but he sold lumber, straw, hay, grain, coal, oil, sundries of that nature. And of course, in those days, there were probably 20 or 30 farms in
Yeah.
Westborough. And so there was quite a demand for grain
Mm-hmm.
for the chickens and the cows and
Right.
what have you.
Great.
And it somehow disturbed him to have me sleeping in bed when I was a callow youth. and he would call up and tell my mother to put Joe on the phone, whereupon he would say, there's a car of corn down here that's got to be unloaded, meaning a freight car,
Yeah.
which was unloaded like that. And the temperature was about 120 in there, I think. So he was much happier when I was engaged in that sort of endeavor. But he did get me a job when I was 13, being an attendant to maybe 1,000 chickens. He had a customer named Beeman who lived on the top of Maynard Street, and they had their hens coops were in a long line, and they had a scoop, not a scoop, but a bucket on a pulley that went through all the cars. So we filled that up with you know what, and we cleaned those coops until they were spotless. Went over the floor with a little hand implement, and then we sprayed them with a mixture of crankcase oil and creosote. So they smelled something like a hospital. And then we put nice shavings in, and oh, it was spotless.
Best cared for chickens in the world.
And it broke your heart to see chickens going in there and doing what they do. Anyway, I worked there for $2 a week, 45 hours. I wasn't too bright, I don't think, because my friends were getting $7 a week at Brigham's hen houses, not hen houses, greenhouses.
Greenhouse, right, yeah.
And anyway, the next year I rebelled and got $5 a week. Most of which went to taking the train to Boston to see the Red Sox.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Great.
And so I worked there for 3 years, which was a duty beyond praise, I think.
Then you went to college where, Joe? Dartmouth?
Dartmouth.
Great.
Yep, I went to Dartmouth in '38, out of a class of 42, and I must confess that my Dartmouth career was spotty or uninspiring or whatever you want to say. I found I didn't have to work in the first semester.
Wow.
I worked pretty hard and was getting all A's and B's, and I thought, well, this is a snap, you know. And so after that, I did the minimum amount of work. I don't know why my father put up with my indolence, but my career at Dartmouth was undistinguished, to say the least. And in the junior year, I heard the guys talking about going to Boston to get into the Navy flying.
Wow.
So I said, that sounds pretty interesting. Can I come? And they said, oh, sure, you don't have to worry about getting taken in. They only take 1 out of 10 or something like that. Well, as a matter of fact, I think about 9 of us went down and 8 of us were accepted.
Is that right?
So they were getting, the Navy was getting itchy.
Yeah.
And
What year was that now, Joe?
41.
41.
For the war. And I took the oath in March 19, I think it was. And that July, I went to Squantum as an seaman second class, of which there's nothing lower. And so we got, I think, something like $30 a month. And subsequently, we were sent to Jacksonville to be aviation cadets, where we received $75 a month. And we thought we were pretty big stuff then, because we had a officer-type uniform with epaulets, you know, 1 star. And we were down in Miami where the Army Air Force was training, and some of them thought we were generals with that 1 star.
You didn't tell them any different, though,
No,
did you?
no, no. And Clark Gable was down there, I
Really?
remember, yeah.
Wow.
He was an early enlistee, probably because his wife, Carol Lombard, had died in a plane crash.
Hmm.
But anyway, we trained at Jacksonville from November until May, and then we went to Miami and trained there for a couple of months, and then we were given our wings, of which we were very proud and stuck up. And our main worry during those months was getting thrown out and getting put in some other branch of the Navy. But we all had dreams of being pilots, and everybody seemed to enjoy it.
Great. What were you flying?
Well, we flew initially the Yellow Peril, which was a biplane, single engine, and was a trainer.
Trains.
Substantially. A Stearman made them. And then we got into something of a slightly more advanced stage. It was a monoplane called a Ryan. It was underpowered, but we felt like we were getting to be super pilots when we flew that.
Yeah.
And after that, we got into Navy dive bombers, but those were biplanes.
Were they really?
Yeah, at that stage of the game.
Yeah.
And also SNJs, which were a beautiful little trainer. The Army called them AT-6s, and the Navy called them SNJs. And they were a biplane, and a monoplane. And whenever you see a war movie and they want to show a zero, they usually
Do they really?
use a SNJ,
SNJ? Yeah.
to simulate the zero, because it looks somewhat like a zero
Yeah.
in its frame.
That's interesting. Now, when you got deployed, what were you flying then?
Well, when we went to San Diego, in the meantime, I had a romance going with Mary.
Yeah.
She had come to Dartmouth to Green Key, which was a favorite spring holiday for the whole college. And I remember when I went home to get her, my brother, without my permission, had been using my car. And it was a little Ford coupe with a cloth top, not a metal top.
With a convertible, yeah.
And he had driven it with his girlfriend in a rather inaccessible spot underneath the coal bins, except he managed to put a hole in the top.
Oh, jeez.
And then he cut the whole top out. He said he was going to replace it with glass. Well, I went home to get my girlfriend off the train from Cleveland, and I was absolutely furious with my brother. I couldn't imagine anything more degrading than to go up to Hanover holding a canvas over the top. Anyway, didn't seem to bother my would-be,
Yeah.
and so that was in the end of '41 up at Dartmouth, and as I said, in training we went to Squantum, which is down near Quincy,
Right.
on the water, and the Navy had a base there, and the Dartmouth group of 8, I think it was, we all went in there. In fact, oh yeah, there was a picture at home called Indian Squadron. That was before the Indian was banished.
Yeah, right.
And
Can't do that anymore.
Joe Kennedy was in this group of
What's he doing?
went the same day I did,
Hmm.
and I got to be quite friendly with him. Very nice fellow, I thought, and he was the heir to be, you know.
Right.
And he was killed in a volunteer mission in England.
Was it?
You know, they had a drone plane that they equipped with immense tons of explosives, and they were going to fly it into the German pig pens, what they called the submarine
Yeah.
holding places, and it had to be manually taken off, this drone, and he volunteered, and he took off, and the idea was he was to parachute out when he got up high, and they could turn it over to the radio plane behind him. However, he never got out. Something went wrong, and
Oh, geez.
the whole thing was smithereens.
Yeah.
And but that's what happened to Joe
Yeah,
Kennedy.
yeah,
He was the oldest, older
Right.
than Jack, of course.
yeah.
And
Now, when did you get sent overseas?
June 42,
And where did you fly out of? Were you off a carrier or you?
off of San Diego.
Okay.
We flew. We were at a sad stage of affairs carrier-wise, because the Yorktown was soon sunk, the Lexington was sunk, the Hornet and the Wasp were sunk. So we only had 2 carriers in the whole Pacific, the Enterprise and the Saratoga. Sarah always was laid up with a torpedo in her. So some wag said the Enterprise fought the war alone. And she did for a while. And so we didn't have enough carriers to go around. And we studied carrier flying in San Diego. And I always enjoyed flying.
Did you?
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. And I liked dive bombing. That was really nice.
Yeah.
Except if you didn't keep alert, there was only a few seconds difference between when you were going into the ground, and a few trainees actually did that.
I think so.
Wow.
You had to keep one eye on the altimeter, and when we stretched the envelope, you were supposed to pull out at 2,000, but we usually went down to about 1,500, and that left you pulling out maybe at 700.
Great.
But it was a lot of fun. Except once I remember I made a late pull-out, and the rear gunner in the back seat, he seemed to think that I had planned it all, you know. Said, gee, that was fun. And I thought, it was anything but fun, you know. When I pulled out and saw how close I was to the ground.
Oh.
But what we did was, we had these little bombs about so big, I guess, and we dropped those within a circle. It was a 50-foot, 100-foot, and 200 feet. And if you could get it in the circle, you probably hit the ship. And if you got it in 50 feet, you knew you hit the ship
Yeah.
that you were trying to hit. Well, the Battle of Midway settled the hash for the Japanese. We sunk 4 carriers. They were all sunk by SBDs, dive bombers.
Is that right?
And the poor torpedo bombers, they had about a 90% attrition. They poor fellas. But anyway, they did divert the Japanese fighters and the fleet, so that when the dive bombers came down, they were unopposed.
Yeah.
And the worst part for the Japanese was not losing the 4 carriers, but losing all the trained crews. Now, America had an endless supply line of new pilots coming aboard.
Yeah.
The Japs didn't have this. So that when they lost their carriers, they lost their crews too. And so they never regained their nautical supremacy after that. And of course, about that time, the carriers, new carriers started coming. When I was based on the Solomon Islands, where a lot of disgruntled Navy pilots were based, we had all had carrier experience. We were flying from a ship called the Long Island, which the Navy pilots called the Short Island. It was a converted merchant ship, CV-1. It was the first one they converted.
Is that right?
And according to what we knew, it had 3 speeds, 10, 11, and 11 and a half. And it was ill-equipped to be a carrier.
Yeah.
But anyway, we all took off and landed on that thing. And also, there was a carrier on the Great Lakes
Was there really?
called the USS Wolverine. It was a freighter or something that was on the Great Lakes, and they converted it into a carrier for trading purposes, obviously. And I was going to be sent there, and I called Mary and I said, get to Chicago right away. And She said, "Oh, I can't, I just started a new job." Well, that was about as popular as you can imagine. And so went to Chicago to Great Lakes, not Great Lakes, Navy base up on Lake Michigan. And I can't remember the name of it. And we all qualified off, flying off this Wolverine. I must say, I was a little discouraged when I saw a plane in front of me take off and suddenly go like that right into the water. And he was gone. And but I don't know why. Maybe stalled in.
Yeah, yeah.
At any rate, I was very confident of my ability to land on carriers and take off on carriers, and only regretted I didn't have one.
Yeah.
So I was sent from Guadalcanal up to Munda, which was a base that we had just recently acquired, north of Guadalcanal, and we were bombing Bougainville, which was still further north, because the Navy and Marines wanted it as an airstrip so they could bomb Rabaul, which was the big base of the South Pacific for the Japanese, a bastion of power. So anyway, that's where I was bombing on this day that I was shot down. And incredibly, in spite of my skill, I managed to get shot down in my first mission. You know, as I was parachuted out, all I could say is something like, "God damn the luck. Why did it happen to me? Why did it have to happen to me?" I was hit by anti-aircraft.
Is that right?
Which was, you know, you couldn't, there was no defense.
Yeah, right. You
It was just the
pure luck.
throw of the dice.
Yeah.
And so I came parachuting down practically over a Jap airstrip that we were bombing. And fortunately, by pulling on the shrouds, I was able to go off the airstrip a little way and landed and took off like a frightened rabbit. But then I realized that I would be a target for running through the jungle. So I hid under a log and waited for dark. And when dark came, I started a program that would take me to the coast, where I hoped to build a canoe or a dugout or find one and get out on the water where I might be spotted by a Navy patrol boat. But that was not to work out. I was in the jungle about 5 or 6 days alone. My rear seat man had not made it out of the airplane, and I never knew whether he got hit or not. I called him and told him I was going to jump, but he didn't answer. And he was a Worcester boy.
Is that right?
Which was just again, the roll of the dice. Yeah. Very nice boy, named Tommy Furlong. And we were great friends. In fact, I was warned by our commander not to be so intimate with him in public view. And rules of the Navy.
Yes.
And anyway,
Joe, you were hid under a log and eventually you were found, or how did you?
Well, that took about a week. I only saw one native, was a native woman down by the river, and I yelled to her encouragingly, but she turned around and yelled to someone back of her, so I decided I'll take off. They weren't supposed to be very friendly anyway,
Yeah.
the natives on Bougainville. And usually if the Japanese had been at their throats, they were inclined to be very afraid of what the Japanese would do. So I did run into a Japanese camp, but I was able to avoid it. And I had nothing to eat for all this week. I once found a native garden and pulled some tubers out, washed them and took a big bite, but they were not edible in that state. Maybe they had to be cooked, I don't know. And so I really had nothing to eat for a week. I was following a river which was supposed to take me to the coast.
Ocean, yeah.
And I came around a bend and I was, as I say, somewhat famished, I guess.
I guess.
And probably my senses were not very acute. And there was a Japanese soldier, and he pointed his gun at me, and there wasn't much I could do. My Colt 45 had snapped off when I jumped. All I had was a hunting knife, the Marine kind, which would probably have done the job, but I didn't feel much like fighting. And so this guy took me back to where his campground was, and there were a number of Japanese there who scurried around me, pulling things from my clothing, and I had a medical kit which I had used. My legs were both burned down by the ankles.
Mm.
The socks had caught a fire, and I had put sulfur powder on them, and maybe that's what saved them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, the Japanese took what sulfur powder was left and threw it up in the air and thought that was a big joke.
Yeah.
Then they got an officer to come, and he told me I was to be taken to their camp at Boone Hill, and where I would be interrogated. Pretty soon a decrepit-looking Japanese automobile came along, putted along, probably burning coal, I don't know. I don't know. At any rate, I got in that and we went down, we went over hill and dale to their camp, their big camp. And the Japanese all lined up to inspect me and spit in my eye and otherwise make me welcome. And they put me in a little cage, probably about as long as this table, and about maybe 3 or 4 feet high. And they threw me in there much like you'd put a bear or a lion or something, and they came to see me in little groups, you know, and giggling and pointing, and I was looking forward to some food, but when I received the food, I wasn't so pleased with it. It consisted of little fish about an inch long, and in some pickled juice, and plus rice. And I was going to become very familiar with rice, because that was all I ate for 2 years. But I couldn't eat very much, and they was interpret with me every day and interrogate me, I should say. They asked me all sorts of questions of which anyone would know I didn't have the answer, like how many carriers in Pearl Harbor and how many carriers at Guadalcanal. And I didn't have the slightest idea. And there was one question they asked me: when will the Americans come to Bougainville? I didn't know the answer to that. They hadn't told us, you know, for obvious reasons.
Sure, yeah.
And I said, soon. Well, they came the next day. So I guess I was then given a red badge for authenticity. Of course, nobody knew where they were coming, and the Japs didn't know, that was for sure. And they landed up in the northwest shore of Bougainville, a place called Empress Augusta Bay, and in no short order, the Marines were able to establish a peninsula or a periphery where they could build an airstrip. The Seabees could build an airstrip. And when I was later on, they asked me, amongst other things, what was your profession? And I always wanted to be a sports writer. So I said I was a sports writer. And I was a good friend of Babe Ruth's. Well, as a matter of fact, I had met the Babe and played cards with him and softball with him up in Hanover. And, well, he was a hero in Japan. He had gone to Japan in the middle 30s, and Bibbo Rutho, he was a big hero in Japan. So I guess they decided they had some specially gifted person, because I think I was the last person that ever got out of Bougainville alive. And I was up there for 3 weeks, as I said, and then they decided to send me to Rabaul. Well, to get to Rabaul, they had to take me by a small Japanese ship about 40 feet long, maybe, and they would go around the island like that and hide it in the morning when the American planes were around, and then we would move at night. And they got me up to the end of the island, the north part called Buka, and they loaded me onto a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night, and we steamed to Rabaul at a rapid rate. And so there I had a chance to meet the Navy, who didn't seem any more hospitable than the Army. And I should have mentioned when I was describing going around the island, at one place, perhaps halfway through my travels, they threw me into a prison where there was an American Marine pilot who had been beaten up very badly, and we were told not to talk to each other, but we did. And I found he'd come down on a small island off of Bougainville, and as I say, has been beaten terribly. And the Japs came and got him, and he said, "I think they're taking me to the doctor." But they didn't, they killed him. And that's why I say I think I was the last American to get out of Bougainville. And maybe because of this fortuitous remark about being a sports writer and a friend of Babe's. Anyway, when I got to Rabaul, I should say that perhaps introduce you to my guard that I had with me for that 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, I guess. He was a sadistic sort that would strike me across the face with chain, and a very nasty fellow. So I was with him for a couple of weeks. And when we got up in the northern part of the island, I could hear gunfire from across the island. It was our assault on this position we had. And I don't know who was firing the shots, the Americans or the Japs, but at any rate, the Americans established their base there and immediately started bombing Rabaul from there, and with Navy planes, not big planes, but mostly single-engine planes. And when I got to Rabaul, we got into a Lincoln Zephyr, which was sort of a reminder of home.
I guess.
Because I used to speed around in my father's. And we drove 2 or 3 miles through the town, which had been somewhat destroyed, but not completely. And I guess they'd been concentrating on airstrips instead of the town of Rabaul, which had no intrinsic value. And we got over to this prison, and it consisted of 6 little cells that were about, probably 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep. And in each of them, there were a number of prisoners. In the first one, a guy spoke to me and said, "Hi, Joe," and it was a friend of mine from Maine.
Is that right?
Yeah, Art Teal. And we went along this group of this line of cells. We came to the 4th, and there was no one in that, and they shoved me in there. And maybe the next day, they brought in, or 2 or 3 days maybe, they brought in John Murphy, who was proved to be the hero of my book. He was a real leader, and he came by naturally, you might say, because he had been stationed as a district officer over the Melanesians before the war for several years. And being somewhat intellectual, he had written a book called The Grammar of Pidgin English. And of course, Pidgin was the language they all spoke. I've heard that there were some 200 or 300 languages in New Guinea. You go over one mountain and there'd be another language. So this Pidgin English that the district officers and the gold miners and coffee planters and whoever happened to be there, they all spoke some fraction form of Pidgin. And me fella belong high mountain, me come with Mary, number one Mary. You know, I was never very fluent in Pidgin, but Murphy was, and he could talk to any native, of course. And so we were ensconced in cell number 4, and what seemed to be the biggest pleasure they had, the prisoners, was they had a work detail, and they let some of them out to do work. Well, everybody coveted that because they get out of for a minute or two. And I finally made it, and we went out on the streets where there was a whorehouse that the Japanese frequented. Probably those Korean girls that we read about a few years ago, that they impounded and sent over there for the service of the army. And anyway, the girls were all waving their handkerchiefs at us, which we thought was kind of nice. And but all we were doing was digging holes. Wasn't very exciting work.
Yeah.
And making air raid shelters. They made air raid shelters out of coconut logs on top. And another event that was quite well attended was sick bay. We had a call for sick bay every day, where the Japanese doctor, who was generally called a horse doctor, or worse, used to sit up on a platform so that he looked down on all the prisoners. And he sat on this platform and gesticulated to some of his orderlies. And he'd say, "Bring that man," or words to that effect.
Yeah.
So he never actually touched a prisoner. Most of us were suffering from malaria at the time, although we weren't really getting, or we hadn't got a full-blown case of malnutrition yet, although it wasn't long in coming.
But how much were you weighing at that time, Joe?
Oh, I probably had gone from 200 plus to 160 or 70.
Yeah.
But, we were all thin, of course. But anyway, our life at the prison in Rabaul was made more bearable by exchanging notes and messages between the cells. And also, once in a while, we'd get a cigarette. And didn't matter whether people were smokers, everyone became a smoker. Because it was, I guess because it was our only pleasure.
Yeah.
And so we would beg cigarettes from the Japanese, and then when we'd get one, we'd light it and pass it along, and it would finally explode in flames along the way.
How did they torture you, Joe? You were tortured, weren't you?
Well, I guess they mostly tortured us by starving us to death. But the worst thing they did really was strike you on the face with, sometimes with implements, you know. And they tortured the natives much worse.
Did they?
They gave them the water treatment, which they'd make them drink as much as they could force down their throats, and then they would jump on their bellies, and that was the water treatment. And some of the prisoners had been beaten before they got to Rabaul, but we were in the hands of the, what you might call the Japanese Gestapo. It was called the Kempitai, and they were comparable to the Gestapo. And they didn't, as I say, beat us regularly. But there was a few bad ones. One in particular named Wada, who would delight in starting his duty to strike prisoners, and across the head mostly, with a club. And he was the most hated man in the prison.
Joe, you were there with how many you mentioned in your book, how many survived? You were in a group of 7 or so?
Well, there were 63 of us, and only 7 survived. When Rabaul was bombed out, they apparently told the Japs, because they put us in a different air raid shelter, a much deeper one, and being concerned over our health.
Yeah.
And we were down in this place, and the bombs were falling, dirt was falling down, water was falling in, and that was a rather grim place. But they finally got us out of there and put us in a truck and took us up the mountains, up the hills, I guess I should say. We found that we were given, we first was put in a cave, not a very long cave, and not a very high cave, not so high. We were handcuffed to an individual. I was handcuffed to an old Chinaman. I don't know why, but we were in this cave, and the first night they came and took 20 away. The next night they came and took another 20 away. And we virtually positive that they were all executed. But of course, when they were making choices, we all wanted to go because nothing could be worse
Yeah.
than what we'd experienced.
Yeah.
But anyway, apparently it was worse, because none of them ever returned. And we had good friends in that group. That left only about 23 of us, and of those, only 7 survived.
Wow.
Uh,
How were you liberated? When did they finally come in?
The Aussies had a ceremony aboard one of their ships, and the Japanese had surrendered, and apparently they told them when they would be getting us, and of course all the time we wondered why they didn't kill us, destroy the evidence, you know. We couldn't figure out why they didn't kill us. And as a matter of fact, that had been the order to Japanese prison camps. In the case of the invasion or the end of the war, kill all the prisoners. So we couldn't understand why they didn't kill us. At any rate, we were taken out of that camp up to a hill where they had a table set up for us with little bundles of goodies for each of us. You know, there was a bottle of sherry and a bottle of scotch. There were, you know, candies and cookies and what have you. Well, some of us went back and drank too much of that scotch and immediately passed out. And several days later, they burned our camp as though to destroy all the evidence. But we were the best evidence.
Yes.
And anyway, they moved us up, further up the mountain to a place that we call, what they called Nanga Nanga, which I'm sure was a native word. And we called heaven, because they gave us blankets, and doctor came to see us, and gave us vitamins, and was trying to put weight on us in vain. And
How much were you weighing then?
about 80. And so the next day they said you will be liberated by the Australians. And then they came and said, no, it's not going to be tomorrow. And of course that was a dreadful blow. And that night we had a terrible earthquake that we thought was going to destroy us, but it didn't. And the next day they said, you're coming now. And they put us in several vehicles and took us down to the water front. But first we passed the battalion of the guards where they all lined up and gave us bonsais as we went by. And some of the guards weren't so bad, you know.
Yeah.
And we got down to the waterfront, and a small landing craft chugged in from a destroyer, and they, well, this was absolute paradise, heaven. We saw the captain, who was sort of a Winston Churchill type jolly fellow. And the Japanese general said, well, I cannot surrender these prisoners to the Navy, but only to the Army. And the Aussie said, I'm taking these prisoners out now. And we were so happy to hear somebody tell the Japs off that we didn't know we were in bliss. And so after getting our cup of tea and some sandwiches, we were put aboard this landing craft, taken out to the ship, and given a lot of cheers on the ship by the crew.
Great, yeah.
And they told us about the atomic bomb, which we did not know about.
Okay.
The colonel that had spoken to us, and the Japanese colonel, had said something about one bomb all the same, plenty bomb, but we didn't know what it was until we got aboard that ship. And so they treated us royally, and we made a voyage to Cape Gloucester, which was probably 200 miles away, where we were greeted by Australian nurses. We hadn't seen a white woman, and we saw one white woman. She was a missionary's wife, German missionary. And that's why they hadn't mistreated them, I guess, because they were Germans.
Yeah.
And Germany had at one point had possession of New Britain Island. And at any rate, we were delighted to be with our friends, our Christian friends, and we were then put aboard another plane and taken over to Leh, which was a prominent American base in New Guinea. And from Leh, we stayed in Leh for a couple of weeks, and we got getting very good care from the nurses. And but I wasn't making too much progress. It was slow going at first. And perhaps they came close to killing me with too much food.
Yeah.
But
Now, in the meantime, your mother had been notified that you were missing in action and then eventually dead, right?
yeah, I was missing in action in the fall, and then declared dead in the spring. And she got the suitable awards for my being killed. And before, and the town had ceremonies, and right after one, a radio ham out on the West Coast, 2 or 3 in fact, received a radio message from Japan, from a ham in Japan. And sounds alliterative, doesn't it? But anyway, the message was somewhat garbled, but it had enough in it that they could virtually establish that I was alive when I wrote the message.
Yeah.
The pitiful part was that others had written letters or messages, and they were dead when they received them.
Yeah.
So just luck that found me alive. And the communication was so poor in those days that I was never able to communicate with my family.
Yeah.
You'd think we didn't even think the telephone hadn't been invented. But I did send a letter or two home, and I guess I received a letter or two. But when I landed at Oakland, I had gained about 40 pounds on that ship. It was 3 weeks for the voyage. It was a clunker. And,
But good food.
yeah, we were right next to the mess. And I introduced myself immediately.
Yeah.
And I had a toothache, and I was groaning at night, and there was a dentist who was being evacuated with malaria. And he said, "Joe, do you want me to take care of that tooth?" I said, "I sure do." So he found the key to the dental lab or whatever, and took me up there, and he says, "Have you ever been hypnotized?" I said, "Not that I know of." So he said, "Well, we'll try that if you'd like." I said, "Sure, anything that
Yeah.
goes." So he hypnotized me and pulled the tooth out. I never felt anything.
Great.
And so when we came back the next day, I told my bunkmates, of which there were about 6 or 7, I said, "Hey, the doctor can hypnotize." And so they all wanted to be hypnotized. And I remember the temperature was about 120, I think. And he hypnotized one time and said, "You're getting colder." The guy started shaking, you know. Anyway, it was quite an experience.
So finally you made it home, Joe, and then you did something that I talked to you about being a hero, and this is something that just I'll never understand because it's beyond me to be able to do what you did. You married Mary, and then after a long career as an attorney, you and she decided to go back
To the Peace Corps.
in the Peace Corps to that very part of the world.
Well, we really weren't exactly in the same part. We were near.
It's good enough for me.
Yeah. Yeah, the Peace Corps seemed like a vista that was open to us, and we loved it, actually. We loved the Peace Corps. And I said we had probably raised the average age by at least 1, because most of the kids were about 24, you know,
Yeah.
22, and
But you were remarkable, Joe, to think of what you went through, what they did to you, and then for you, with so much grace, to say, "I want to go back and do something good for them." That's great.
well, we did enjoy it, and the Japanese had been very strong where we were, the Saipan and the Mariana Islands, and there was a dreadful bloodbath that occurred on Saipan when the Marines eventually took it. The Japanese died to the last man, And they were even throwing off Japanese civilians off the mountain into the water or the rocks, and little kids, and but that was their way,
Yeah.
which we could never understand. They thought we were cowards, I think, for surrendering. But of course, to us, there was no point in fighting if you didn't have a gun,
Yeah.
and or if you were wounded. So we didn't quite see their point. But if you study Iwo Jima, Okinawa, or any of those places, it's easy to see that how the Japanese mentality was. They were to fight to the end.
Well, you're a fighter to the end, and it's been a real honor to be with you. And this is the book we're talking about. If you haven't seen it, go to the library and get it. I don't know if it's still in print, Joe. Can you still buy it?
No.
Well, I'm sure that it's...
The only place you could buy it is on the Amazon or the web.
All right, well, there it is. It's a real tough read about a real great guy. And it's been a real honor to be with you. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you, Bob.
Thank you for having us.